Hello, my name is Christian Chun, and the title of my talk is The Yellow Peril or Model Minority, Fighting Both Discourses. So there have been various textbook representations of Asian immigrants' success stories in the context of English language learning classrooms in the US and Canada. The trend has been part of the larger discourse of why immigrants from some countries have made it in society, but not others. Although these discursive representations appear to be well-intentioned in their attempts to acknowledge superdiversity, such discourses have warranted closer critical examination of the ways in which they racialize, essentialize, and perpetuate specific cultural historical identities that support racial hierarchies and enact power dynamics of who is defining and who is the one being defined. From the mid-1960s until the recent COVID-19 viral pandemic, the various interactional engagements that have helped construct the indexical order discourse of Asian Americans as the model minority. This positioning of Asian Americans as a monolithic, homogeneous group conveniently ignores not only the ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and historical diversities among and within communities identified as Asian American, but also their blatantly huge economic disparities and resulting poverty levels. However, long before the mid-20th century invention of the model minority discourse, there was a discourse of the Yellow Peril, positioning Asians, and in the context of the US, Asian Americans, as the dangerous Oriental other in this country. The term, the Chinese virus and Kung flu that has been used by Trump is rooted in the return of this discourse, which has resulted in the past year an increase of violence against people of Asian ancestry. Drawing on my own social media engagement with a person adopting this Chinese virus term and my own lived experiences with both the model minority and Yellow Peril discourses, I addressed the need for social linguists and activists to work together toward co-constructing counter-hegemonic discourses of racial justice and solidarities in dismantling the others. So during the spring of last year, a colleague posted on her Facebook page criticizing Trump for his using the phrase the Chinese virus. A friend of theirs replied, "It did start in China." I debate whether or not to respond to this comment since I don't know the person and because of my fatigue from engaging with strangers on social media over political and social issues. However, with the rise of violent attacks on Asian Americans in the US following Trump's use of the Chinese virus and Kung flu, I felt compelled to respond. And this is what I wrote. As someone who's an Asian American, I can say that I've been targeted because of my visage due to the racialized fear stoked by this discourse of the Chinese virus, AKA the Yellow Peril, which has had a long history of violence toward Asian immigrants and Asian Americans in the US. Your comment that it did start in China justifies not only this discourse, but also enables violence toward others. I don't imagine you supporting discourses targeting women and other people of color and its implied justification of violence toward them. It's important for us to stand in solidarity with one another. The person replied back, "It does not have anything to do with racial ethnicity. It's simply, where did the virus emerge and how do we prevent worldwide pandemics in the future? It's very apparent the virus began in China. Many plagues, viruses, and diseases come from all around the world, which these illnesses know no ethnic group. It's essential to know where the viruses originate to have a better understanding how to eradicate the illnesses. Sorry if I offended you personally, not my intention." So my reply, thank you for your civil reply and explanation. And there is, however, a difference between saying the virus is from China and saying it is a Chinese virus. As you know, some strains of the flu have started in the US, and according to the Center for Disease Control, over 30,000 Americans have died from it, but no one uses the phrase, the American flu. Gee, I wonder why. And the origin itself has nothing to do with scientific research to eradicate, since viral components are not ethnically specific. They just target the entire human species, no matter where we live or come from. The person's friend replied, saying, "So that means we should demonize the Chinese?" And the person replied back, "No, I never stated that. And you of all people know I would never be discriminatory towards anyone. just really think the diversions are unnecessary. I only stated a fact: the virus started in China in a contained area last year, then rapidly spread through the country. China released in December they had this virus, but it was not known how contagious it was until it was too late to stop the spread. Hence, our borders were closed to China once it was widely known this was going to be a pandemic. That is what I'm saying. Everyone needs to relax and stop accusing everyone of being racist. Facts are facts, not racism at all. This commenter adopts the familiar stance in insisting their discursive use of the term the Chinese virus is not racist, only factual. It seems citing the so-called facts is convenient when they are framed in support of a particular discourse. Other facts that debunk the truth claims made by the same discourse is dismissed or ignored. The juxtaposition of them acknowledging that the virus does not have anything to do with racial ethnicity, and that the phrase simply indexes where the virus emerged, dialogically echoes Trump's stance on adopting the same frame. Although the commenter recognizes viruses can originate anywhere, they don't address why this one was attributed the ethnicizing adjective of Chinese by some people, while other viruses were not, for example, SARS. Their uptake of the discourse of the Chinese virus in these times illustrates again the point made by Voloshinov that, quote, the orientation of the word toward the addressee has an extremely high significance. In point of fact, word is a two-sided act. It is determined equally by whose word it is and for whom it is meant, end of quote. The phrase, the Chinese virus, in this interactional context clearly and exclusively belongs to those who see it for what they think it is, the foreign, menacing threat of the other invading the US. The discourse of the ominous other has had a long history in the US, which has been ideologically personified in enslaved people, refugees, foreign religions, and specific immigrants at historical junctures. And with the pandemic, there's been a return of a specific other now, the so-called model minority, who has become the Yellow Peril once again. Long before the mid-20th century invention of the model minority discourse, there was a discourse about Asians and Asian Americans that was prevalent going back centuries with the advent of European imperialism and colonization, that of the foreign menace and the unknown, the dangerous Oriental other. The term Yellow Peril became prominent in the 1800s, which was accompanied by the ongoing European invasion, occupation, and carving up of countries in Asia, including India, China, Taiwan, and the Philippines. In the US, Chinese immigrant workers have been living and working here since the early 1800s, started to arrive in increasing numbers with the 1840s gold rush in California, and then even more a few years later to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. They were praised for their steadfast labor despite their being paid much less than their white co-workers, only to face outbursts of violence such as lynchings starting in the early 1870s after their labor was no longer needed by railroad manufacturers. This resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 passed by US Congress, which was the first attempt in the US to ban immigrants based on their race and class, in this instance, all Chinese immigrant laborers. This lasted to varying degrees until 1943, which was officially repealed because China was an ally of the US during World War II. However, it still continued to some extent until the mid-1960s, concurrent with the advent of the model minority discourse. So throughout the decades of the 19th century to at least the mid-20th century, there were several racist discourses about Asians that were semitized in specific images portraying the menace of the Yellow Peril. One was the octopus with slanted eyes and tentacles grasping and strangling either the globe or a defenseless white woman. Another was the character of Fu Manchu, also with slanted eyes and long fingernails, essentially claws, armed with a drug needle to stick in the arms of, again, a white woman in fear for her life. Although these images are no longer in dominant social circulation, the discourse of this menace lives on because, quote, in the contemporary Western world, to evoke Yellow Peril has become synonymous with the looming dread where the potential threat is as good as any actual violation, end of quote. That's by Chen and Yates, 2014. Indeed, like a ideologically and racially co-constructed ghost, the Yellow Peril continues to haunt. And the term, the Chinese virus, that's been used by Trump thus has a long history rooted in this return of the discourse of the Yellow Peril. And it's in the past year, with a number of people, increasing attacks on people being told to go back to China with their virus while getting hit and spit upon. And the only new thing about this, about me and others being told to go back to China, is now we have to bring our virus back with us. So I was born and raised in New York and lived in the United States for most of my life, but numerous times throughout my life in the US, I've been asked the question, where are you from? And when I answer, and the follow-up question would be, oh, I mean, where are you really from? So the following incident took place at one of my former universities. And this professor colleague asked in the morning in the hallway, oh, hi, Christian, I have a question for you. And me thinking it was work related, yes. They said, could I ask you a personal question? What is your language of origin? And I looked at them and I said, New Yorkese. And they said, no, I mean, where are you from? New York. They said, no, I mean, what languages do you speak? Is it Chinese? And I said, no. And they said, oh, well, I have a student and I want to make sure I pronounce their name correctly. It's spelled Huang. And I was like, okay. And they said, oh, sorry, did I just stereotype you? And as I walked into my office and shut the door behind me, I said, yeah, let me think about it. So this has been a fairly kind of typical encounter in which that I've been positioned in the context of the US as the forever or permanent foreigner. So no matter how many decades people's ancestors have lived in a country, in my case, my ancestors arrived here almost 100 years ago, others, over 200 years ago from East Asian countries, they've always been positioned as the forever foreigner. Now, with the advent of the model minority discourse in the 1960s, that was started by the sociologist William Peterson in an article published in the New York Times Magazine, in which he praised the achievements of the Japanese Americans for their, quote, strong values and work ethics. Now, interestingly, just 24 years earlier, the entire Japanese American population was incarcerated by President Roosevelt during World War II because of their ancestry and the US government's fear that they would somehow betray their country fighting Japan, although not one had ever been charged for committing treason against their country, the US. Then a mere 24 years later, their seemingly inherent traits of working hard and loving their family as if no one else does made them the model minority rather than being the, quote, problem minority, as Peterson coined it during World War II. Now, was it just a sheer coincidence, this remarkable turnaround of Japanese Americans from being the potential enemy within to the model minority occurred during the 1960 civil rights movement, fighting for the equal rights of Black Americans? So this discourse had continued until last year with the pandemic. One example of this was the 2018 film Crazy Rich Asians that reinforced the now common perception of the typical wealthy Asian family, which the Asian American woman marries into. As Kathy Park Hong wrote in their book, Minor Feelings, an Asian American Reckoning, quote, the takeaway from the crowd-pleasing opening scene in the film Crazy Rich Asians is the following. If you discriminate against us, we'll make more money than you and buy your fancy hotel that wouldn't let us in. Capitalism as retribution for racism. But isn't that how whiteness recruits us? Whether it's through retribution or indebtedness, who are we when we become better than them in a system that destroyed us? End of quote. This discourse, though, of the model minority goes beyond this in its racializing strategy in anointing one group as the model over other minorities in the US, particularly the Black community. And it's clear that the discourse of the model rather than the problem minority has supported the racial hierarchy in the US. However, like any racializing discourse meant to enable a hierarchy with the aim of dividing people against each other, to prevent solidarities working for social and economic justice for all, it was only a matter of time before this model minority discourse would give way and return to a pernicious discourse again in times of panic enabled by capitalist-driven economic competition across the globe. The discursive positioning of Asian Americans as the model minority has always been problematic. For those who might have taken comfort in the notion that they were valued more than other minorities, the current discourse of the Chinese virus serves as a reminder that those in power who anoint one as the model can and will eventually reconfigure the same one as a threat when it's convenient for them to do so. So those in power have long sown divisions among people by co-constructing intersecting economic, racialized, gendered, and sexual hierarchies. However, there have been movements throughout history that have transformed, or at least attempted to do so, political, economic, and social relations in the name of equality, freedom, and justice for all. These beliefs held by particular segments of the populace these hegemonic beliefs, which were circulated by schools, religion, and the media, perpetuate the notion of specifically targeted humans as being much less worthy than others, justifying an ideologically socialized order of humanity at historical junctures. How did they defy and transform their previously held beliefs that have been taught, learned, and embodied in their schooling communities and societies? How can people transform their views that are perpetuated by those in power? Now, part of this, of course, this discourse of the other that becomes the new them, or rather joins the company of others, or those people, the them. But this them who attempts to destroy our lives never includes the capitalist ruling class. And this them raises the binary opposite, of course, the us. Yet who is the us? Who gets to belong in the us? Is the us always homogeneous in terms of demographics, be it race, gender, class, sexuality, and any combinations thereof? And if not, how and why does the identity, as it were, of an us change? This discourse of the us is, of course, contextualized within the discourse of the you. As Sarah Ahmed wrote, quote, "It's not the case, however, that anybody within the nation could inhabit this you," end of quote. So who gets to inhabit the you and become part of the us? Many a political leader has presented this discourse of a nostalgic longing for a fictionalized past in which a specified and named people are accorded the singularized and sole identity of the nation. In the case of the US, politicians have often proclaimed, "We, the American people." Yet, depending on the audience the politicians are addressing, American index not necessarily everyone who would identify as an American. Would an American citizen who had immigrated to the country be seen as an American, i.e. part of the us, you by everyone in the audience? The framing of us, you, and presenting a selected unity of a certain demographic along racialized ones aids in shifting the focus away from the hegemonic political and social order of the elites to an ideologically invented adversary, the them. This co-construction of the them is a second function that acts in dialogical tandem with the chosen us, who are accorded the singular, nationalistic, racialized, and linguistic identity, as in the case of the US society, being white, English-speaking Americans. Indeed, the role of politically motivated and produced emotions of a particular people, quote, "provide a script, certainly. You become the you if you accept the invitation to align yourself with the nation and against those who threaten to take the nation away," end of quote, by Sarah Ahmed. So this crisis presents a historical opportunity for people to reject all racializing discourses, be they positive or not, in working towards solidarity with one another against the real ongoing threat once this virus has abated. As someone who spray painted on a wall in Chicago put it so succinctly, "Corona is the virus, capitalism is the pandemic."